Hello, Jahnavi. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation here at the newly opened Science Gallery. I came yesterday and had a fantastic walkthrough through the exhibition, and very impressed and happy about this new venture, which is so much more than just a museum, right? It's a place of engagement where science and culture come together. We will kind of delve into a conversation which is ongoing for a while, and I think we need to be careful that we don't gallop ahead, because Jahnavi was kind enough to come to a symposium that we organized in Switzerland on the transcultural aspects of collaborations between science and art in Switzerland, in Zurich, in September. You'll find these panels and conversations and also her contribution online. Then I was lucky enough to be in Goa when you co-curated a show on blue carbon for the Serendipity Festival. And it's where we kind of continued our conversation on how to display blue carbon to a public. And now I'm very happy to be here, but I just wanted to be transparent and tell you that we've been having this conversation now for a while, and just signal us if we go too fast, too far ahead. We don't want to skip like the basics, because I mean, this is basically what you're doing here. You're laying a lot of groundwork for going beneath the surface with this institution. So I think we will talk a lot about the title of our little conversation, which is Beneath the Surface. And when it comes to blue carbon, most of the things are beneath the surface of the oceans or the water in the mangroves all around India. But maybe you could explain, as a specialist, to the public, because I wasn't sure what blue carbon is a year ago, right? So what is it, blue carbon? What does it mean?
Yeah. So thank you, Damian. It's really wonderful to continue the conversation. Let me state some very basic facts about blue carbon, also because as you can see, our audience is wide, and there are some of you here who will be specialists and who will know far more than I can in this domain. And then there are others who are coming to something like this in order to explore it. So in a sense, the starting point is not the same, and that's why Damian's question. So I will just read out a couple of lines so that it's clear, it's simple, and it's not, and then we can kind of delve deeper into why, what, and how this is relevant to the conversation today. So blue carbon refers to carbon dioxide that is absorbed from the atmosphere and stored in the ocean. So that's the simple starting point. Blue, of course, is referring to the watery nature of this storage. The vast majority of blue carbon is carbon dioxide that has directly dissolved into the ocean. Now, much smaller amounts are stored in underwater sediments, so coastal vegetation and soils, and ocean life, from whales to phytoplankton. And do hold the whale in your mind. I'm not going to say don't think about the whale, in fact do think about the whale. When experts usually talk about carbon storage potential of ecosystems, they usually mean salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrass meadows. So that's the ecosystems that they're largely thinking of when they discuss carbon storage potential as sort of a mitigation for the devastation and the nonsense that we, in a sense, the nonsensical process of consumption that we have let loose on this planet. Now, so this is by way of just saying that this is sort of the very basic thing from which we start out to think about blue carbon.
entanglement of whales.
Yeah.
I was very fascinated by that. Did you know that, I mean, the history of whaling is very close to my heart because of Moby Dick, which is one of the greatest books ever written, right, in any language. And it's a very technical book. I mean, a lot of chapters are dedicated to the intrinsic art of whaling and how you can use all the parts of the whale and how whales were like the driver of pre-industrial and pre-scientific technical innovations, right? And then on the other hand, whales, especially larger whales, are incredible drivers of the ecosystem of the ocean, right? So they feed in nutriment-rich regions of the ocean and then have the decency to have sex in another part of the ocean which doesn't have a lot of nutrients, right? And while they do that, they produce a lot of shit, as I understand it.
Yes,
excuse my language, it's scientific language. Huh? And this kind of feeds the phytoplankton, and phytoplankton is responsible, I learned today, for 50% of our atmosphere, of our breathable air. And at the same time, any single whale, I learned, can retain up to 33 tons of CO2. To put this into perspective, I always have to kind of compare it to things to understand how big this is. A tree will absorb about 68 pounds of CO2 per year, right? So 200 years, that's quite a bit of pounds, but it's not 33 tons, every single whale. If you think about big whales like sperm whales or blue whales or any other big whale, we have now left about 3% of the original population that we used to have in the 19th century, right? So imagine if we kind of could repopulate the oceans with whales. Then we could all be flying Indigo a go-go, right? It's like, no?
Yeah, I think there would have to be like a scientific diplomatic dialogue with the Japanese and the Norwegians, which would be the first step towards revailing the ocean, so to speak. But you're right. I mean, there are numbers, and so as I like to say, what we will do and we hope to do and we are already doing is have cultural conversations about science and the human, social, and natural sciences, about knowledge, about research in the gallery. And therefore, when you make it cultural, of course, it becomes about the everyday. And when it becomes about the everyday, suddenly, if you're looking for numbers that you didn't make up yourself, so the expectations from not just this conversation, but the kind of work you see here, is the work that we have ahead of us in the years to come. So when the goal is when the goal is to bring science back into culture, as we call it, right? Like that's our vision statement. What does that mean, right? Because it could mean that we could get someone here to speak about blue carbon, give a lecture with about 58 slides in 20 minutes about, the graphs and the charts and the numbers, and those who are interested will gain a lot out of it. Those of us who want to actually understand about it rather than it itself will be left out, right? And this is the place to actually think about science. So this is something also that I say, right, that we don't, there's no don't actually, so it's don't use negatives. The goal is to create a conversation around, right, like around and about. Why does this matter? So why does blue carbon matter? But also why does curating and why does curating a cultural sort of conversation or a research festival or an exhibition around things that are happening, in labs, why does that matter, right? Like what is the purchase of it? So just a few words about what we did in Goa at Serendipity, right? Like to give a third example. So we have these two exhibits which you probably saw during the walkthrough if some of you were there during the walkthrough. And if not, just, go have a look. What we tried to do in Serendipity, I mean, Goa being coastal, offers a different kind of opportunity, right? Because that ecosystem is no longer a conceptual or a theoretical one, it's actually a part of everyday life. So if you want to actually delve deeper culturally into blue carbon, then that's the place to go, right? Like the socio-ecological question is alive when you are in Goa. So what Ravi Agarwal, who is the host in this conversation, and was in Zurich as well with us, and was in Goa as well with us, and is the co-curator of this exhibition as well. What we did was, and together with Madhu, in fact, who's today done the due diligence of introducing both of us, we looked for people who were working on blue carbon and marine ecology and marine biology, who were interested in creating public engagement around their research. So we looked for a few people, we looked at their papers, we read their papers, we also had conversations with them. And then we also looked for recommendations on from the Serendipity Festival team for artists who were based in Goa who would be interested in being engaged with this research at all, right? So, and the condition, right, like the condition of this exchange or the condition of this collaboration is one where the artist is not illustrating the work of the scientist, right? Like, so this is not about please find a better way to visualize this so that people can make sense of this. This is about, not an illustration, not a data visualization, not a representation, but an engagement. So in the first instance, what we were looking for was an engagement between the artist through their own practice, for lack of a better word, and the scientist through their own practice. And then how would this come together to be represented in something that becomes accessible to the public? And by accessible, I don't mean that they can understand, but that we create an exhibition-like thing, right? Like where people can walk in and then they can see what came out of this conversation, and so there are two levels of engagement. The first is between the artist and the scholar, and the second is one of the outcome with the public.
I think you're jumping ahead a little bit because
tell me.
this display you have here with the whales,
Yeah.
and the blue carbon and the whaling and the whales,
Yeah.
that's like a first step to me, the way I read it.
Yeah.
It's done by a group, they call themselves the aesthetic,
Yes.
the aesthetic of carbon, or what it's
Yeah.
and what they did is basically a very interesting and animating visualization of the different aspects of that phenomena.
Yeah.
So that's, to be precise, that's actually a visualization of a topic which is well researched. And it has its value, right? Because it teaches you in a way that a simple slideshow can't, because you have to interactively look for different things. You're engaged with the display. So there's already...
But that's not mere visualization,
right? But
it's already gone beyond visualization.
It's a visualization which forces you to interact with it as the viewer.
Yeah, but so I think so.
But it's not a collaboration between the artists and the researchers who found the whale fountain or all these kind of things, right?
So each work would be different.
Yeah.
But also it's about how you put it out into the public domain for public engagement, right? So so the whale exhibit here, for example, I think it goes well beyond visualization, right? Like, because it's not a mere representation. It calls for someone to actually engage with it, find out more about it. And there is also, what's that? Olfactory experience that goes with it as well, right?
There's this incredible thing called ambergris. Do you know about ambergris? If you find that stuff, you're rich, right? It's like, it's the vomit of whales.
And it's terrible to smell.
And you find it on the beach sometimes. It looks like a weird stone. And if you find one like that, you can sell it for $150,000.
Yeah.
Because the perfume industry, specifically in the East, in Dubai and places like that, they go crazy for it, right?
Yes, no, indeed. So, so you want us to dissect these two before we go to the one?
Yeah, because I think it's an interesting journey, because it's about different aspects of how you display blue carbon and how you engage with the artists, scientists, how they engage with each other, and how we engage with the public, right?
Yeah.
Because it's different, I
think. It is different. No, absolutely. I mean, the idea of sharing the Goa example is to present that example, and then we can also again come back to this, which everybody here will have the opportunity to witness. But one of the reasons why I would like to detail the Goa example is also because now there is no longer the opportunity to actually witness it, right? Like it's gone. And the thinking behind it is, the reason I would also like to share the thinking behind it is also because that was an engagement that we staged.
Yes.
Whereas here we were given, or this was submitted to us as a return to an open call. So we can, I think towards the end when we wrap up, we can actually kind of do the juxtaposition and contrast and mapping. We can certainly do that exercise, because that will give us a typology in a way of how and through using blue carbon specific examples, how it can actually happen in an exhibition space, how things can happen in an exhibition space, and what that might mean for engagement, what that might mean for public education and a range of other things. So coming back to he loves the whales, I was clearly happier in Goa because I wasn't working like I do here day in and day out. Yes, so the thing was to find artists who were willing to engage with this person who we would work with the marine biologist. Now what ended up happening, and I'll speak to one of the examples because we had two, and one of them worked in a way which we thought was so fabulous that it doesn't actually happen all the time, but it's a good example, and then we can walk in a way backwards to think of the others. So the marine biologist in Goa, Vardhan Patankar, some of you might even know him. He has been recording underwater sounds for years in reefs, in other areas, sounds made by fish, sounds made by corals, and sounds, underwater sounds. So he has absolutely, one of the fascinating parts for me was the incredible equipment he had for doing this kind of work, including underwater paper, which I did not know existed. So he got his notes written on underwater paper, which is just, totally fascinating. So what, and the example that I'm talking about, the artist, media artist, sound artist, I don't quite know what one might call her. She has her own description. I think she does say media artist, or they call themselves a media artist. Now, Kaldi Moss is the artist's name. What they did was, and they gave us descriptions of it. I went to Goa and met them once before I met them again in Goa when we put up the exhibition, the exhibit. They met several times to just understand what they were doing, right? Like so, and then when Kaldi found the archive that Vardhan had, she began to go through it in detail. Now, it takes a certain kind of person who listens to hours and hours and hours and hours of sound footage from underwater. She turned out to be that kind of person. And at some point, she noticed an acceleration of sound or an enhancement of sound, which she then went back to Vardhan and asked him what it was. And then he began to look at the log of his data and understood that this was the sound of the reef fish
cases, the better we understand these kind of interconnectedness between these systems, right? So the scientist didn't know that he had this material which would pinpoint something which is actually a scientific discovery. That's one thing which came out of that, which is astonishing. That's the best case scenario, right? The other thing which you could ask, or I would like to ask now, is why is it then important to put it into an aesthetic experience, right? So the Serendipity Festival, it's an arts festival. It's dance and theater and visual arts and cooking and eating. And it's a great place. If you have time, take a night bus and go and visit next December. But my question remains, so there's this collaboration between an artist and a scientist, which is great because it had the best outcome possible. Why then display it to a general public as a sound piece? Why create this aesthetic experience?
You're asking me?
Asking you, I'm asking myself, I'm asking the public, but you're here, so maybe you could start to answer it.
So his curatorial experience is far longer than mine. I mean, I came to doing curation. I was as an academic, until about 6 years ago, I was doing regular teaching and research and things like that. I think it'll be great to hear your answer too. I'll give my brief answer. She said, and then we'll listen. Would love to listen to what you have to say as well, because I think So coming to your question, why do this? Why recreate this, or why create an exhibition? And I think there's a huge gap between research and the public. And what happens inside labs stays inside labs. And by that I mean, I'm not talking about translational research and it getting commercialized and things like that. I'm just talking about what happens in the lab is not generally known outside the lab. And that has consequences, right? Because many a times there are experiments and ideas that are entertained and discussed inside labs, especially in India, paid by the taxpayer, but its implications are not discussed anywhere outside. So decisions on new kinds of technologies, be it artificial intelligence, be it new genetic technologies, new gene-based medical technologies, be it things related to climate change, things are thought of by people who are supposed to know, and then the rest of the world is outside the lab doesn't know. And we function, I think, under this delusion, which is largely problematic, because very few of us are unfortunate enough to not know anything, right? Like we come to occupy our place in this world knowing something at least. It might not be the exact same thing as the other person knows, but we know something, and therefore we are able to know. And if you begin from that assumption, then the first hindrance, in a way, the unwillingness to share what's happening in the lab can be challenged on that front, right? Like so there is a fundamental, like in the United Nations, Human Rights Declaration, right? Like the right to science is enshrined in there. So I think that's the first level for me, which is an important one, which is that someone who's not a practicing scientist still ought to know what's happening, because research is being done not in the name of a person or an institution or even a country, but it's been done in the name of this species, right? And its ability to know and its desire to know more about what's happening around us. And so I think in order to address that, we need to build this bridge, because we ought to know what's happening about us to us as a result of research that's happening in labs that are not accessible to us. And so that's one part of it. And why this has consequences is because you are being asked to make life choices, or your certain kinds of life
even changes, right?
Exactly.
Life changes.
And they are presented to us as fait accompli, when we've not had the chance to shape it, nor do we have the chance to question it when it was being done.
I've been thinking about that. It's my first time in Bangalore. I'm very excited to. So, and today we went to Chickpet, I think it's called. It's an area of town. I'm sure you all know it very well. And to a Swiss person, it's very busy, right? There's a lot of people there, a lot of traffic, a lot of cars. And I was standing at the corner and looking at all these people and thinking, when 300 million people from the Punjab, Rajasthan, and Bihar will move here in 40 years' time, because it will be too hot there to live, it will be even more busy, right? It will be busy in a way that maybe you don't like anymore. It's going to be very different if 200 million people move within one country. And this is a distinct possibility depending on the climate changes over the next 40 years. You will either experience, or your children will experience that, or not, right? And part of the equation is that it might not happen this way if we change our relationships towards nature, towards climate. We change certain ways of how we think about consumption, all these kind of things. But this is a tricky thing to do. And I think one of the main hindrances in this whole discussion is a thing called empathy. Empathy is not to be mistaken for compassion, right? So we know, that compassion, it's an integral part of a lot of deities in religion, in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. Compassion is central. But as humans, what we need is more of empathy. Empathy is part brain, part feeling. It's understanding something from the other point of view, right? So it's not easy, but it's very doable to develop compassion for another human being. Specifically, if you recognize this human being as being part of our group of human beings. It's maybe more difficult to have to have empathy towards a street dog, right? Which is a being, but it's not a human. It's very, very difficult to have compassion for a forest, mangroves, for an abstract system of something. For the climate. What is the climate, right? It's not the weather. It's more complicated than that. It's a system. And still we are asked to develop this kind of empathy towards this huge system to change our ways of interacting with it. And that's something which is very, very difficult. So one way to do it is to build empathy machines. Machines that help us to develop empathy towards certain things. Because, like whales are very beautiful creatures. So it might be, easier to have some empathy towards a whale if you're not Japanese or Norwegian. It's much more difficult to have empathy towards a complex system of nutrients, phytoplankton, all these kind of things. But these are the game changers. If we understand the systems, we might be able to kind of protect the systems that create it. And we understand scientifically the role that the fecal matter of the whales play in the production of our breathable air since 5 years. That's a very recent discovery. So how do we integrate this immediately, right? And this, I think, is where the aesthetic experience comes into play. Like theater, literature, exhibitions can be places where we learn empathy towards these things because we experience it holistically. We don't just read something, or it's not just somebody, pushing slides through. It's not a teacher in school being boring, right? It's something that you can experience. For example, if like here with the whales, if it's interactive because you like games on your phone, right? So, no, you don't like games on your phone? Big exception, but most people like games on their phones. So you have this interactivity, which is one thing, or you have this immersive experience of embodied knowledge kind of exchange in the acoustic sound piece, right? And the goal is always to create understanding, engagement, and through understanding, engagement, empathy, which hopefully leads also to certain changes, I would argue. That's my explanation why it is so important to create aesthetic kind of displays that go beyond the visitor walking around the museum. Because let me just add one more thing which is really important for a place like this. One of the main problems about exhibition making is the great people standing here in the back. Are the mediators, are the texts, are the audio guides you get in a museum, because it leads to something called interpassivity. Interpassivity is the opposite of interactivity. And I don't know how it works in India, but in the States you have these soap operas, right? Or these sitcoms they're called, you know, it's funny stuff. And they did research, because in the American sitcoms you have a thing called canned laughter, right?
Laughter, yes.
So they do something funny in the television and then people in television laugh. And they did a study which showed that if we watched it, and if there's canned laughter, we laugh less ourselves because somebody else is doing the laughing for us. If there's no canned laughter, we laugh more. We think it's funny on either way, but we don't laugh as much because somebody else is doing the laughing. And this is what's happening in museums all the time. You go there and everything is explained to you. Right? And this is where museums spend money all over the world. This is where you still get some budget, right? Is educational programs, children's programs. If everything is explained to you all the time, you don't have to experience it or think about it, because somebody else has done it for you, right? The director, the curator, the wonderful mediation team that we have. So there needs to be a balance. And the whale thing is a good example, right? Because when I went there today, I had this wonderful mediator, I think she's here. She explained the thing to me and really kind of piqued my curiosity. But then I had to do something myself. I had to kind of go through it and look at the stuff that really interested me. So this is true engagement. It was not that she did the thinking for me and I was completely disengaged.
multi-pronged engagement with the research that they're doing, and they invite us into it, and they invite us to consider the question. And it's a coming together of their work, and like you said, right, like the three forms in a sense, or three different ways of how knowledge and or scholarly work and knowledge and aesthetic engagement can come about. This is also a multi-person project, not only in its research but also in the number of artists involved. Yeah, I don't know if I can say more to it than this.
You know what struck me when I've seen it? I mean, this is a very specific case again. And we could argue, as a public here in Bangalore, what do mangroves in Goa have to do with me, right? Of course, climate, blah, blah, blah. We understand that by now. But it's not something that has implications for everyday life. Mm-hmm. And still it does. And I was introduced to a program years ago here in Bangalore, because Bangalore used to be one of the cities that people in Europe talked about as being one of the first cities running out of water in the near future, right? It was always like, oh, let's make sure that we don't end up like Bangalore, right? It was always the boogeyman in the conversation.
Yeah, I remember a piece in The Wired.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
So, oh, Bangalore is running out of water. And fact is, it is not anymore, right? Mm-hmm. There seems to be a revitalization of the water systems of Bangalore, and it seems to be that you will have drinking water at least for the next 20 years, which is nice, right? I mean, water is kind of nice. Do you know why you have drinking water for the next 20 years? I mean, it's kind of an important question, I would argue, because the moment you don't have it anymore, you would be interested, right? So one of the main reasons is the revitalization of old well systems and of semi-permeable lakes connected to them.
Including one in our backyard.
Yeah, including one just right here, right? So the scientists who came up with these solutions by going back in time to talk about the future, they learned a lot about water management in the mangroves, how the mangroves flow. And they implemented it with the old well system here in the city. And that's kind of fascinating. It's the reason, I mean, the solutions they came up with are simple, they're cheap, they're restoring some important heritage of your city, right? Which kind of got built over in the frenzy to become a modern place. And it makes sure that you all have drinking water. And I have drinking water here as well, right? Which is nice. I like water. But the ideas behind it were heavily inspired by this research and visualization done on water in the mangroves. So, I mean, to me, this is a very direct link to everyday life. It's not something that happens somewhere.
Absolutely. So now you know why, we bring Damian also to Bangalore. Yeah.
To remind people, keep care of your wells. You have such beautiful wells, by the way. Yeah. I love your wells.
Including the one in our backyard. At some point, I think people should go and